June 3rd, 1942, Midway Atoll, 5:27 a.m. The rising sun paints the ocean in molten gold as the first Japanese scout planes slice through the clouds, engines rattling like distant thunder. Inside a shallow trench beside the airstrip, Marine Corporal Lewis "Red" McCarthy presses his cheek to the chilled binoculars. His breath comes sharp and quick. The sky hums with danger. But something is wrong, or rather, something is missing. From the sky, the airfield below should be obvious, a strip of pale, crushed coral, straight as a ruler, impossible to hide on such a tiny speck of land in the middle of the Pacific. Yet the scout planes drift overhead, sluggish, uncertain, and they don't attack. Red's jaw tightens. He glances across the open ground where the runway should be glowing like a white scar against the island, but instead he sees nothing but broken blotches of brown and gray, shadows that don't move, patterns that trick the eye. Even he, a man standing just yards from it, can barely outline the strip. "You've got to be kidding me," he mutters. Because the runway hadn't disappeared. It had been erased, painted out of existence with a magician's sleight of hand. And the man responsible wasn't a general, wasn't even a soldier. His name was Ray Kellogg, a Hollywood special effects technician whose day job was making movie monsters look real and miniature battleships explode on cue. A man who spent more time around studio backlots than battlefields. And yet, against every expectation, his craft had followed him into war. Red ducks as the first Japanese bomber growls past, low and searching. The plane banks, hunting for a target that should be impossible to miss. Its shadow sweeps across sandbags and palm trunks. Still no bombs fall. The pilots can't find the runway. Not because of luck, not because of weather. Because a film technician had taken one look at Midway's blinding white airstrip and said, "I'll make it disappear." But how? How does a man used to painting cardboard mountains and crafting miniature skylines manage to fool trained military pilots scanning from miles above? The answer begins not on Midway, but in a small, dimly lit room at 20th Century Fox months earlier, when an officer in crisp khaki strode onto the studio lot and changed Kellogg's life, and with it, the fate of the Pacific. The door to Stage 5 at 20th Century Fox slammed open, letting in a slice of California sunlight. Ray Kellogg squinted up from a table cluttered with paintbrushes, scrap metal, and an unfinished miniature destroyer. A studio assistant stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the two uniformed officers behind him. Navy intelligence, crisp, polished, and very out of place among papier-mâché mountains and smoke machines. One of the officers stepped forward. Raymond Kellogg. Ray wiped his hands on a rag. "That depends. Are you here about the monster I blew up yesterday? Because I can explain." The officer didn't smile. "We're here because we need you to teach America how to hide." Kellogg blinked. He'd expected a dozen things. A briefing for a training film, maybe a request to build a model of some new aircraft. But this was different. He led them deeper into the studio, past wooden submarines hung from wires, and cardboard cityscapes tall as giants. The air carried the sweet, dusty smell of matte paint, the scent of illusion. The officer pointed at a miniature cliff face Kellogg had been painting that morning. "It looks real," he said. "It is real, as long as the camera believes it. Light, shadow, texture, they're all liars if you know how to use them." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "That's why we're here." He laid out a series of reconnaissance photos, aerial shots of Pacific outposts, islands ringed with blue water, and on each one, something glaringly obvious practically shouted from the image. Bright, clean airstrips, thin, pale stripes, easy targets, impossible to conceal. Kellogg leaned closer. The problem was obvious.
coral runways reflected light like polished glass. Even a passing aircraft at 10,000 feet could spot them with one eye closed. "You're telling me you want to hide this," Ray said. "We want to make it invisible," the officer replied, "because the Japanese are coming, and they know exactly what to look for." Ray felt the weight of the words. He'd spent his life fooling cameras, lenses, film stock, carefully controlled lighting. But this was about fooling trained pilots, scanning from a world above, in real sunlight, through shifting clouds. A different kind of audience, a different kind of stage. He picked up a brush and tapped it against his palm, thinking. "Your pilots," he asked quietly. "What altitude do they bomb from?" 10 to 15,000, sometimes higher. Ray studied the photos again. The geometry, the glare, the tonal contrast between coral and scrub. He didn't see military infrastructure. He saw a movie set. And a bad one. "Gentlemen," he finally said, "your problem isn't the runway." He lifted a photo, tilting it toward the ceiling light. "It's the shadow it casts. It's the uniformity. It's the way the eye grabs onto patterns." He pointed at patches of natural earth on either side of the strip, uneven, darker, irregular. That's what camouflage needs to mimic. Not color, not detail. Chaos. Sheet the runway in chaos, and the mind won't see it. The officers leaned in. Ray walked them through principles he'd learned on sound stages. Breaking outlines with false shadows, scattering irregular debris fields, using mismatched tones instead of matched colors, painting gradients to erase edges, creating optical noise that confuses the viewer at a glance. Almost like painting a giant matte backdrop, except this one needed to withstand bombs. The officer closed his notebook. "Kellogg, how soon can you get to Midway?" Ray looked around the studio, the wooden castles, the fake jungles, the miniature tanks, toys compared to what lay ahead. He set down the paintbrush. "As soon as you need me." He didn't yet know that within weeks he would stand ankle-deep in hot coral dust, staring at a runway so bright it hurt to look at. And he would need to make it vanish before the Japanese fleet arrived. And if he got it wrong, Midway would burn.
The heat on Midway Atoll hit Ray Kellogg like a wall the moment he stepped off the transport. Dry, heavy, blinding. Even the sand seemed to glow. Marines hauled crates across the beach, while seabirds wheeled overhead, crying out like warning sirens. A Navy lieutenant jogged up, hand raised. "You Kellogg, the Hollywood guy?" Ray shielded his eyes. "Last I checked." The lieutenant pointed toward the center of the island, a jagged white line carving through the brush. "That's your canvas." Ray winced just looking at it. The runway shimmered like a flare. Even from ground level, the glare was brutal. From the sky, it might as well have been screaming. As they drove closer, the strip grew brighter still, until Ray had to look away. Coral, thousands of tons of crushed coral, dazzling and smooth, reflecting sunlight in one clean, unnatural plane. No shadows, no texture, nothing organic. A movie set with the lights all wrong. He took out a small sketchbook and shaded a few rough shapes, blotches, gradients, jagged silhouettes. The Marine standing nearby watched like he was performing some kind of sorcery. "What are you drawing?" one asked. "Confusion," Ray answered. He assembled a team, Marines, CDs, anyone with steady hands and patience. Buckets of paint were hauled out, browns, grays, muddy greens, but Ray rejected half the colors immediately. "Don't match the terrain," he instructed. "Match the idea of the terrain. Think broken, think messy, think like nature on a bad day." For every patch they painted, Ray stepped back 50 feet,
testing how the eye followed lines, where patterns formed, where shadows pooled. He scraped away sections that looked too deliberate. He spattered others with bristly brushes, creating haphazard streaks. By noon, the men were dripping with sweat. By sundown, their arms ached. By midnight, under dim lanterns, Kellogg was still walking the strip, tilting boards to simulate morning shadows. The next day came the second layer, the one borrowed directly from Hollywood trickery. Ray gathered driftwood, scrap metal, chunks of broken crates, palm fronds, even torn canvas. He scattered them across the runway in scattered, irregular fields. Not enough to hinder aircraft. Each piece was small, movable, arranged in flow lines that wouldn't catch landing gear. But from above, they formed noise, visual static, the enemy's nightmare. He directed Marines to drag weighted nets across the strip in erratic arcs, leaving behind sweeping, natural-looking smudges. No straight lines, no repeating shapes, nothing a trained eye could lock onto. Off to the side, a group of skeptical pilots approached, arms crossed. "You know we're supposed to land on that thing, right?" one of them asked. Ray didn't look up. "Not until the right moment. And if we can't see it?" Ray finally met their eyes. "Then I've done my job." The pilots exchanged uneasy glances. Kellogg didn't blame them. He'd be terrified too if someone told him his landing zone was about to be turned into a magic trick. By the third day, the transformation was nearly complete. The runway no longer glared. It no longer beckoned the eye. It looked like a long, broken scar in the earth, irregular, dull, forgettable. Exactly what Ray wanted. But the true test wouldn't come from ground level. It would come from the sky, and far sooner than anyone expected. At dusk, as Ray was checking the western edge of the strip, a Marine runner sprinted toward him, breathing hard. "Sir, enemy scout plane spotted, coming in low." Ray looked up at the horizon, the sinking sun bleeding red across the clouds. Perfect. He needed to know if the trick worked. The enemy scout plane roared closer, a speck of metal turning into a shadow, then a shape, then a threat. Ray stood perfectly still on the edge of his newly painted illusion. Would they see the runway? Would they see him? He didn't know, but the plane was seconds away from telling him.
The scout plane appeared over the horizon like a dark blotch against molten sky, engines rattling in sync with Ray's heartbeat. He could almost feel the hum through the soles of his boots. Marines scattered to cover, but Ray didn't move. Not a step, not a blink. He had to see it. He had to know. The plane banked, swooping low over Midway's central strip. From Ray's vantage, it seemed impossibly high, impossibly close, all at once. He held his breath, scanning the underside of the aircraft for the first glimpse of recognition in its crew. Their target should be glowing white below them, a clear line to aim for. Nothing. The plane passed directly overhead, shadows streaked across the coral, yet the strip itself seemed to dissolve beneath it. Ray's chest tightened as adrenaline cut through the fatigue. Then the bomber leveled, circled, and passed again, over and over. Red McCarthy, crouched nearby, finally whispered, I think they can't see it." Ray felt a shiver run down his spine. Months of Hollywood tricks, lighting, shading, optical illusions, all adapted for real life, had worked. What had been a glaring beacon for destruction was now a ghost, invisible, untouchable. The Japanese pilots eventually banked away, leaving the runway untouched. Not a single bomb fell, not a single life was lost. Word of the miracle spread quickly through the island. Marines and Seabees exchanged astonished looks. The officers, once skeptical, nodded in muted acknowledgement. Ray stood silently, feeling the weight of something he had never truly understood until now. His work, meant for entertainment, had saved lives. Yet the moment was short-lived. The real challenge loomed on the horizon. Intelligence reports were already arriving. A full Japanese strike force was en route. They weren't scouts this time. They were bombers, hundreds of them. coming for Midway. Ray knew instinctively that what had worked for one plane might not hold for the fleet. The stakes had escalated. Every shadow, every blotch, every tiny scrap of camouflage would be tested against thousands of eyes trained for war. And if it failed, Midway would not just burn, it could decide the fate of the Pacific. Ray clenched his fists, looking at the runway he had painted into invisibility. Sweat and dust coated his skin. Exhaustion pressed on him like a physical weight. Yet beneath it all, a spark of certainty flickered. Let them come. We're ready. From somewhere far above the horizon, a fleet of enemy planes rose into the sky. Engines growled, wings sliced clouds, and as they approached, Ray realized this was the ultimate test of a movie man's magic against the might of an empire. Would Hollywood illusions really hold against real-world destruction? Seconds stretched into minutes. The answer would soon be written in fire, smoke, and the chaos of battle.
The roar of the Japanese fleet grew louder, a wall of sound rolling across the atoll. Bombers swept into formation, glinting metal against a sky painted with the last light of dawn. From the ground, Marines gripped rifles, pilots gripped yokes, and Ray Kellogg gripped a paint-stained wooden post, heart hammering in time with the engines above. The planes descended. From above, the runway should have been a stark white line screaming for attention. But to the pilots in those cockpits, it dissolved into the surrounding coral, scrub, and debris. Light hit the patterns Kellogg had painstakingly applied. Shadows streaked across surfaces. Blotches misled the eye. Irregular shapes masked straight lines. The strip wasn't invisible in reality, but it was invisible to the enemy's perception. The Japanese flew directly over it. Directly over it. Bombs fell, but not on Midway. They landed in the surrounding reef, harmlessly splashing into the ocean, leaving the airstrip untouched. Marines stared, mouths open. Pilots blinked in disbelief. The airfield, the lifeblood of Midway's defense, remained intact. Kellogg's Hollywood magic had transformed into a shield of survival. Every brushstroke, every scatter of debris, every simulated shadow had been a soldier in its own right. And then the U.S. carrier planes struck. From decks hundreds of miles away, American aircraft launched their counterattack. They caught the Japanese by surprise, sinking carriers, crippling fleets, and all because the island's airstrip had remained a phantom. Without it, planes would have no launch point, no hope of resupply or repair. The battle raged for hours, but the invisible runway never faltered. Kellogg walked among the Marines as night fell, exhausted, sunburned, hands blackened with paint. He had never carried a rifle into combat, never flown a plane, yet in his own way he had saved the lives of thousands and turned the tide of war. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who spent his life creating illusions for film had just created the most important illusion of the war, one that could kill, survive, and shape history. Years later, historians would debate strategies, codes, and intelligence. Few would remember the Hollywood technician who made the coral vanish. Few would write about Ray Kellogg, the man who used light, shadow, and human ingenuity to outwit an empire. But on Midway, in the heat of June 1942, his work had been as real and as deadly as any cannon. As he looked up at the stars that night, dust and sweat streaking his face, Ray allowed himself a small, rare smile. The enemy had not seen, the island had survived, and for one brief moment, Hollywood had won the war.